Rishi Sunak, the Prime Minister, as you almost certainly know, last night warned police leaders at a Downing Street meeting that mob rule is replacing democratic rule. This came just a day after the Home Office announced a £31 million package aimed at protecting MPs in the wake of the Israel-Gaza conflict. Some, like the increasingly political Amnesty International, have said that Sunak's words are an exaggeration. Protest is, after all, fundamental to democracy. But the actions and words of these protesters for Palestine have gone beyond what we would usually consider peaceful democratic protest. A minister has resigned because of the death threats he was receiving. Harrow Harman has called for remote voting because of the pressure she felt protesters were putting on elected representatives. And Ben Jamal, the leader of the Palestine Solidarity Campaign, has actually told supporters he wanted to force Parliament to lock its doors. Mr. Jamal may not have quite achieved that, but democratic process did temporarily break down last week after parliamentary convention was broken by Mr. Speaker out of concern for the safety of MPs. Is this just the rough and tumble of democracy, or is there something deeper at play? Well, with me now is the Labour councillor, Peymana Assad. Thank you so much for joining me. Are you concerned that democracy is being affected by mob rule?
Thank you so much, Jacob, for having me on your program. The first thing I would say is that, protest is protected. It's a freedom of expression and freedom of assembly that's protected by UK law. And I think that we should make sure that protest isn't politicized and the police shouldn't be used by politicians to make political points. That's the first thing. The second, I believe, is that protest outside members of parliament's homes and their offices is an intimidation tactic. It's actually turning people away from the Palestinian cause. And I think it's absolutely concerning that this is going on. And I think that it shouldn't be, considering what happened over the last decade to Joe Cox MP and David Amos MP, and the fact that, there's staff, there's family, there's children involved in this who are living with members of parliament at home, and there's staff in their offices who have absolutely nothing to do with the votes that members of parliament take. They're just there to do public service. So I think that those two things are really important to understand. And the last thing I want to say about the language the Prime Minister used is we're not ruled by a mob. We are a democratic and free country, and we should pride ourselves in that. And I think it's really important that the Prime Minister uses language that helps people come together at a time of high tension and not use language that helps further divide society in such a difficult situation.
But I think what you're saying is very measured, but isn't it all about drawing dividing lines, that the right to protest is very important, but when people are chanting from the river to the sea and projecting it on the Elizabeth Tower, when, as with one of the GBNews presenters, people are attacked and have eggs thrown at them and the police stand by, doesn't that make you think that there is an element of mob rule in addition to MPs' offices and houses having protests outside them?
I think the police should be taking a lot of action when it comes to violent protesters. I don't agree with violence in protests, especially targeted at journalists or members of parliament or their staff walking to and from parliament. And I understand that these protests have made the Jewish community in London feel very unsafe or feel intimidated. They feel they can't go into central London. I personally don't go into central London on Saturdays when I know that there are protests, but that doesn't mean that I think that we should stop these protests just because there is a minority who are trying to disrupt peaceful protests. For people who are trying to argue for a humanitarian ceasefire, releasing of hostages, more aid into Gaza, a two-state solution, the majority of people out on the streets, I understand where their emotions come from because they're watching all of this happen on television, even just today with accusations that the IDF fired into civilians trying to access aid in Gaza, for example. These are very emotive images that are being shown on our television screens, and there are people in this country who empathize. They don't want people to die in Gaza, and so for that reason, I empathize with what they're trying to achieve. I just don't think that violent protest is the right way to do it. I do think you're right, Jacob, in that police should have powers to stop violent protesters. I've been subject myself to violent protest and intimidation, and I think that it's completely wrong, and I think it makes us an unsafer society in general.
Well, Peymana, thank you so much. I think you put it in a model of reasonableness, and I found myself in a worrying degree of agreement with a Labour councillor. So I'm so grateful you came on.